Imagine this, a college dorm room in Georgia. Thin walls, cheap mattresses, students cramming for exams. And behind one of those doors, an 18-month-old baby, crying, and then suddenly, silence. Minutes later, the toddler's father returns and finds the child completely unresponsive. He rushes the child to the ER, where the child is found with a cracked skull, a brain bleed, and internal injuries doctors said looked more like a car crash than a fall. And the only other person in that room was a former beauty queen. This is the Trinity Poague toddler murder case. And the deeper you go, the darker it gets. This is Christopher Winchell with Crimes Digest. Crime news, cross-examined. Welcome back. If you're new here, I'm a former criminal defense attorney, and I've handled cases just like this. Skull fractures, brain bleeds, a young child thrown against the wall, cracked ribs caused by one angry adult in one terrible moment. So when I saw the autopsy findings in this particular case, the Trinity Poague toddler murder trial, I knew exactly what the prosecution would argue. And yes, exactly what the defense would try to do. Because I've been there, standing, as I do right now, right in front of the judge with my clients in cases just like this. And trust me, they're never as simple as they look. So let's examine the facts in this case, because once you understand the medical evidence, the verdict becomes a lot clearer. January 2024, Georgia Southwestern State University. Trinity Poague, 18 years old. Former Miss Donaldsonville. She's babysitting her boyfriend's toddler, Romeo Jackson Drew Angeles, in her own dorm room. Dorm residents report hearing the baby crying. Not fussing, not whining, crying like something was seriously wrong. Then suddenly, silence. Moments later, Trinity calls the child's father, saying he won't wake up. The father finds the toddler unresponsive and then rushes him to the hospital. And the injuries unfold like a medical horror story. Skull fracture, brain bleed, bruising on the side of the face and torso, a lacerated liver. And I'll tell you from experience, that injury alone almost never comes from a simple fall. At the hospital, Trinity says that Jackson had been eating chips and suddenly became unresponsive. However, her story then changes. She then tells that he simply fell, at different times describing a fall from the bed and then from a chair. The prosecution pointed to those shifting explanations as a huge red flag. Additionally, regarding the alleged fall, doctors unanimously responded, absolutely not. And that's when the homicide investigation began. Here's how the prosecution put this case together, and their logic was brutally simple. Prosecutors began by building a clear narrative. First, the injuries. Doctors testified these were high-force injuries, the kind you see in car crashes or intentional blunt trauma, never from a short fall. Second, the timeline. A long crying, then sudden silence window lines up perfectly with escalating force, then collapse. Third, Trinity's search history. After the child was rushed to the hospital, she goes on her phone and looks up, quote, how do you get a brain bleed, end quote, and, quote, skull fracture toddler, end quote. And finally, opportunity. She was the only adult in the room, no alternate suspect. For the state, this was an open and shut case. And here's where the case becomes more complicated than people realize. Let me switch hats for a moment, because the defense in this case did have arguments. Number one, there were no eyewitnesses. Nobody saw Trinity Poague strike that child. Number two, yes, accidents can produce unusual patterns. I once handled a case where I retained a defense expert who found that the child's skull fracture could have happened from a fall rather than from blunt force trauma as claimed in this case. So medicine is not always perfect. Number three, Trinity was a teenager with no history of violence, no prior incidents of harm to the child, no complaints of mistreatment at all. The defense had to push hard with the idea of reasonable doubt in this case, and it actually worked, partially. The jury did not convict her of malice intentional murder, but they did convict her of what is known as felony murder. So how can you get murder without intent? Here's how Georgia law works. Georgia, like most states, has something called the felony murder rule. If you commit a serious felony, like aggravated battery or cruelty to children, and someone dies because of what you did, the law can treat that as murder, even if you didn't intend the death. In this case, the underlying felonies were things like causing serious bodily harm to a child, causing injuries that disfigure or seriously damage organs. And that's exactly what the medical experts described. Skull fracture, brain bleed, lacerated liver. So once the jury decided, yes, she did that to him. Yes, those injuries caused his death. Felony murder almost automatically follows. That's why they could say, not guilty on malice intentional murder, but guilty on felony murder. Unfortunately, the same deceased child, but a different legal theory. Now let's cross-examine both sides in this case, because it isn't airtight as people think. For the prosecution, where's the pattern? Where's the motive? If she's an ongoing abuser, why no prior injuries? No CPS reports, no documented history whatsoever, nothing. And remember, this happened in a college dorm. Thin walls, constant noise, that's a hard place to hide repeated violence. For the defense, explain the injuries. A short fall cannot produce a skull fracture and a lacerated liver. It doesn't match physics, it doesn't match medicine, and every doctor said the same thing. That crying to silence moment, way too consistent with escalation. And then we have the system itself. Felony murder. This is a doctrine that lets prosecutors skip proving intent in a murder case. I've never been fully comfortable with it because it transforms what was an assault, in this case, into murder, not by what the person intended, but by statute. Yes, it's legal, it's court-tested theory, but it's a blunt instrument. So let's turn to my ruling. Based on the injuries, the timeline, and the exclusivity of access to that dorm room, this was not an accident. The medical findings alone, skull fracture, plus a brain bleed, and that liver laceration, that's way beyond anything you'd ever see from a short fall. So I agree with the felony murder verdict. But this was not malice murder. It was felony murder. And here's why that legal distinction matters more than anything in this case. If Trinity Poague had been convicted of malice murder, she would be serving a life without the possibility of parole. Most defendants in malice murder, child death cases, never see the daylight again. But because the jury acquitted her of malice murder and only convicted her of felony murder, her sentence became life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. And yes, the 30 years is flat time. No good time. No early release credits. Georgia law does not allow good time credit to reduce the 30-year minimum required before parole eligibility on a life sentence for murder or felony murder. So in plain English, she must serve all 30 years with only credit for the time she actually served before her trial. And that time is what we call day for day. No early release for good behavior. No earned time deduction. So it's the same headline, life sentence, but a completely different reality. So whether you think the jury went too far or not far enough, their decision didn't just label the crime. It changed the rest of her life. Now I want to hear your ruling. Did the jury get it right in this case? Or did Georgia go too far in the Trinity Poague toddler murder trial? Drop your verdict in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown helpful, please subscribe and like. It really does help the channel grow. For deeper written coverage of this case and hundreds more, visit crimesdigest.com. And as always, the truth matters, and so does reasonable doubt. See you in the next trial.